Hey there, TBD listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, As Seen on EV. Did you know that most EV models can travel 200 miles on a fully charged battery, with some up to 500 miles when fully charged? You can charge them at home or at thousands of DC fast chargers nationwide. And how about this? EVs produce zero tailpipe emissions. Talk about living more sustainably. Head to seenonev.com to learn more, and stick around to hear from people who love their EVs. Just a quick heads up that there is some swearing in this episode. Okay, here's the show. One of the things I noticed this week when I was researching this episode is that very few virologists want to talk publicly about the lab leak theory of COVID. So when I got Angie Rasmussen on the line on Wednesday afternoon, I wanted to know why she was different. Why are you willing to talk about it?
Because I shut my mouth off about it in February 2020.
In her day job, Angie studies emerging viruses at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. In her off time, on Twitter, she's pretty famously blunt.
I don't remember what I called Tom Cotton, but it was something probably not very nice, because he was at the time saying that, for sure this was manufactured and it may have been intentionally released, it may have been accidentally released, but this is the product of, so-called gain-of-function research and possibly a bioweapons program. And even back then, when we knew very, very little, that did not seem plausible to me at all.
It is definitely possible to get sick in a lab that handles pathogens. Angie is the first person to admit that.
It's something that I worry about every day. Right behind me is a containment lab that I work in. Right now, there's nobody in there.
Oh, yeah.
And that's actually a tuberculosis lab. But I work in the lab right next door on the other side of that wall. And maintaining proper biosafety protocols is something that means a lot to me, because I literally don't want there to be a lab leak in my own community with me as the index patient when I'm working with SARS coronavirus 2 or anything else. I think that, most virologists who are doing this work, it's something we're keenly aware of the possibility of having happen.
But it's not what Angie thinks happened in the case of COVID. Indeed, she co-authored a paper published last year in Science magazine saying SARS-CoV-2, that's the virus's formal name, came from a market in Wuhan. She is firmly Team Zoonotic Spillover.
I'm on the so-called Zoonotti. That's one of the names that some of the lab leak proponents have started for us.
Oh boy.
We're like the Illuminati, except I guess the virology and evolutionary biology version of that. Some other people call us the Zoo Crew. But yes, I think I'm like the head bitch in charge of like the Zoonotti.
But Angie also has an open mind. She's willing to blow up her own hypothesis. What I wanted to know is whether this week's news from the Energy Department submitting a vote in favor of the lab leak theory was enough for her. Today on the show, why Angie is still skeptical. I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and As Seen on EV. Electric vehicles offer so much more than a way to get you from point A to point B. Just ask any real EV owner.
The EV that I drive, I love the dependability and range.
The rebate, I got $7,500 back.
Since driving an EV, I've found that I've really looked forward to any reason for getting in my car.
A lot of friends have driven my car and loved how it drives. I think when you get into one and drive it, the ease and the fun, it speaks for itself, honestly.
I care about sustainability a lot, and it gives me peace of mind knowing that driving a car with zero tailpipe emissions means that I'm doing my own small part.
What I love about owning an EV is never having to go to a gas station. It's smooth and quiet.
I can charge my EV while continuing to live my life.
I actually feel good and happy when I get into my EV.
From SUVs to hatchbacks to trucks, there's an EV that's right for just about any lifestyle. Electric vehicles are worth watching, so head to sceneonev.com to learn more. That's sceneonev.com.
Go to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Meet with an expert who'll do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from the stress of taxes and file for you so you can do not taxes. Show your eyes things that are not taxes. Unpack a moving box of not taxes. Taste not taxes. Sing not taxes a lullaby. Hope not taxes sleeps through the night. Grab a saddle and ride not taxes into the sunset. With TurboTax, an expert will do your taxes from start to finish, ensuring your taxes are done right, guaranteed, so you can relax. Feels good to be done with your taxes, doesn't it? Come to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax. Full service products only. Video meeting while expert does your taxes required. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Back in 2021, the National Intelligence Council put out a report evaluating different theories of where COVID-19 came from. In that paper, 4 intelligence agencies thought the origin was zoonotic, with low confidence. 2 were undecided. And the FBI, with moderate confidence, thought it came from a lab. This week, the Wall Street Journal broke the story that the Energy Department, which was part of that original report, had now shifted to favor the lab leak theory, with low confidence. The DOE report is classified, so we can't fully evaluate it. But I asked Angie what she thought of the journal story when she read it.
It was really light on any details. Essentially, that reporting said, well, the DOE says that, with low confidence, it's a lab leak. And that was it. Like, no evidence. These IC assessments are from a minority of the 8 different IC
intelligence community.
Yeah, exactly. These conclusions that it was a lab leak have come now from 2, the FBI and the Department of Energy. There's 4 others that have said with low confidence that they think it's a natural zoonotic origin. And then there's 2 that are undecided. So I would say that is a minority of the IC agencies that have been looking into this while the investigation's ongoing. And I understand that, intelligence is like spy stuff, and some of that will be classified and not declassified. It's really impossible to say how confident I should be about any of this, how much it would move the needle, because, again, I can't evaluate that evidence. What I do know is that things that are of low or even moderate confidence, as said by both the DOE and reiterated last night by FBI Director Christopher Wray.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
I don't think that it's going to completely upend what our conclusions say and what the bulk of the scientific evidence shows.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was that you wrote on Twitter that you have an open mind. And I wonder if you could put into lay language, like what it would take for you to be convinced.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't I tell you what's convinced me so far that, in fact, it is zoonotic. We actually do have quite a bit of evidence that shows that the pandemic started at the Wuhan seafood market sometime probably in late November, at the latest early December 2019. And that data is really multiple threads of evidence that show that not only were there live animals at the Wuhan market, they were there at that time, including species that we know are susceptible to SARS coronavirus 2, including raccoon dogs, including minks, including red foxes. We also know that when these animals were sold at the Wuhan market, and we know this actually because one of my co-authors visited the Wuhan market in 2014, presented to him as a place where spillover was likely to occur. And he was able to take pictures of some of these same species of animals, including raccoon dogs, being kept in very close quarters with people with other species of animals. So the conditions were right. And then we did an analysis of all the early cases of SARS coronavirus 2 or nCoV 2019 at the time, regardless of where they were or whether or not they had any epidemiological link to the market. We took those early cases and looked at whether or not they were associated with the market, whether or not epidemiological investigations had linked them to the market somehow. So they went there, they worked there. We looked at those cases, and sure enough, all the cases altogether were strongly associated with the market at the center, which you would expect if you're including those cases with known links to the market.
But then when the team looked at early cases of COVID among people who didn't work at the market or shop at it, it turned out they lived nearby.
It is not a coincidence, essentially, that market is right in the middle of all those cases that, again, had no link whatsoever to the market. So that said that essentially we were on the right track. The second thing we looked at were those animals. And this is the part that I contributed to more. And that was that we did a whole bunch of different types of detective work, as well as looked at the WHO mission reports, as well as looked at a paper that was published in the summer of 2021 that was not actually remotely about coronaviruses or anything like that. It was looking for ticks in animals that were being sold at live animal markets in Wuhan from 2017 to 2019. And even though the WHO mission report said that there were no live animals being sold at Wuhan, this paper conclusively showed that, consistently, actually, all these different species, including all these susceptible species, were sold there from 2017 into late 2019, when the pandemic started, until the market was closed. We were also able to find a report from the China CDC that showed that there were environmental samples all over the place.
That's like a swab from the market?
That's like a swab from the market. And those were positive for SARS-2. They were able to sequence whole genomes off of them. They also tended to cluster in the part of the market where not only did they sell the animals, there were actually 5 positive environmental samples at the same stall where my co-author, Eddie Holmes, photographed a raccoon dog being clubbed to death in 2014. So this really indicated to us that not only was the live animal trade alive and well, but it was occurring, in fact, at Wuhan market, including of species that are susceptible. And then finally, another companion paper that I wasn't a co-author on looked in great detail at the phylogenetic analysis, meaning it looked at the sequences of all those early cases of the virus. And what they found was that there were actually 2 separate lineages, so essentially 2 variants. There is no way that could have happened as a single spillover event. So that means that there basically had to be 2 spillovers at the market, probably within about 2 weeks of each other.
Because a virus wouldn't have had time to mutate into 2 different lineages?
What it all boils down to is that if you try to explain this as a lab leak, that means that you had to have somebody, and if we're talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it's on the other side of the Yangtze River, and it's about 8 kilometers away. You're talking about somebody gets infected with lineage B at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, for some reason goes straight to the Wuhan market without infecting anybody else on the way there. And then the next week or 2 later, the same exact thing happens independently with lineage A. Is it possible? Yeah. I mean, a lot of things are possible, but isn't it a lot more complicated and difficult to explain than just a bunch of animals had the virus spreading between them, potentially between them and the people that worked with those animals? And then it spilled over twice to people who then started spreading it to each other, because that is another thing that makes Wuhan unique. It's a city. And so if spillover occurs in the city, there are going to be many more opportunities for that virus to establish human-to-human transmission.
I'm listening to you, and I've read your paper, as much of it as I, admittedly, an English major, can understand. But I think there are a lot of people, and I'm talking about good faith people here, who can say, well, wait a minute, there was this city, Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was there, the Wuhan CDC was there, and voila, there is a virus there. This is the short version of this is the Jon Stewart explanation.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think?
How do you feel about that? Like, how do you want people who have that occur to them to think about this?
So I think that we really need to think about this in two ways, right? It does seem suspicious because we've all heard about all the SARS-2 work that was going on at WIV. And we've all heard, that what are the chances, let's just say, at any lab in Wuhan, let's say they found the precursor virus. That's why it would completely change my calculus. And that's why I would revise my view to actually think that it was a lab leak. And the reason for that is, what are the chances? What are the chances that a virus would naturally emerge on the other side of the river when the lab had the same virus in its collection and just happened to be using it? To me, that would be a high indication of a lab-acquired infection. But that's not what we have evidence of.
Angie says she's also not persuaded by the theory that virologist Xu Zhengli, who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, had anything to do with the pandemic. Xu, sometimes referred to in COVID discourse as the Batwoman, studies coronaviruses.
And actually, in January of 2020, her behavior itself is very inconsistent with somebody who's trying to cover up starting a pandemic. She went in December, I think, to a Nipah virus conference in Singapore. Pictures were posted of it on Twitter, not in the context of like, oh, good thing I'm out of Wuhan right now. It was more like, great to see all of my international collaborators at this Nipah virus meeting. Pretty normal scientific stuff. In January, a colleague of hers who is now in Singapore, Linfa Wang, he's a very famous bat coronavirologist and virologist, was visiting Wuhan and went out to dinner with his whole group. They were hanging out, taking group photos, not acting at all like people who would have just, caused a pandemic and were trying to cover it up. I have to say, if I knew that I had caused a lab-acquired infection of any kind and I was trying to keep it secret, which I wouldn't do, probably would I be going out into the city that this virus was now secretly spreading in and, go out for dinner and invite my friends to come visit and my colleagues to come visit? Probably not. The final thing is that Xu Zhengli has published extensively on all of her new coronaviruses that she's found as she's isolated them and has continued to do so actually throughout the pandemic. So I really don't think that we are going to see evidence that for whatever reason, she was sort of arbitrarily covering up having a SARS-2 progenitor.
When we come back, what about the other lab in Wuhan? It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Other credit cards often charge annual fees for access to perks you might not even use, or that can come with restrictions. Apple Card gives you valuable benefits without annual fees. In fact, there's not a single fee at all. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval, variable APRs for Apple Card range from 15.24% to 26.24% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of January 1st, 2023. It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Other credit cards often charge annual fees for access to perks you might not even use, or that can come with restrictions. Apple Card gives you valuable benefits without annual fees. In fact, there's not a single fee at all. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval, variable APRs for Apple Card range from 15.24% to 26.24% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of January 1st, 2023.
Everyone's talking about the rare health benefits of macadamias. Like, did you know they have more healthy fat than avocados? It's why they're so highly recommended by athletes, doctors, and diet experts. Get your fill at House of Macadamias. They have a high-quality range of delicious bars, purified oil, and nuts. So indulge in health. Any unsatisfactory orders are redeemable. And to get 20% off your purchase today, visit houseofmacadamias.com/podcast.
What Angie comes back to is not the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the other labs there. The thing that she says sets Wuhan apart from a number of other similar places is a well-documented live animal trade.
And that in itself creates a risk, a known risk, that exactly mirrors the risk that was recognized at the time of the SARS classic epidemic and emergence. The other thing is that spillovers actually happen pretty frequently, including spillovers of SARS-related bat coronaviruses. And some models have, we can't ever really know the number, but some models have estimated that there could be tens of thousands, potentially even hundreds of thousands of spillovers of these viruses every year, just in East and Southeast Asia. Now, why don't we have hundreds of thousands of pandemics every year? I'm very glad that we don't. But that's because a lot of the time spillover happens and it's a dead end. One of the reasons it can be a dead end is that there's no other person in very rural areas to pass that virus on to. But in a city, in a market where a lot of people are indoors together, they're in contact with those animals that are kept at the market, they're working at the market all day, there are many, many opportunities for a very lucky virus that happens to be very good at growing in a variety of different species, which we now know that SARS-2 is, to establish human-to-human transmission chains. In a city of 11 million people, that actually argues, I think, strongly for zoonosis, because you actually would have the opportunity in these circumstances to establish that human-to-human transmission and gradually spread it throughout Wuhan and then throughout the rest of China and then throughout the world.
I wanted to ask you about the other research lab, the Wuhan CDC. There's some reporting from CNN that whatever the DOE assessment is that it's based on something about that lab. And I saw you tweeting about this as well. I wonder what you could tell me about that lab and then why you kind of went, meh, no.
Yeah, so we never really went, meh, no. We were like, oh, interesting. This lab is, right down the street from the Wuhan market. But according to the WHO report, they moved there on December 2nd. Now, when you move a laboratory, you're not moving over your whole lab in the morning and then just decide to whip up some virus cultures in the afternoon. Usually it's a lot more work than that to actually move an entire laboratory. Could there have been an accident or an issue in the course of moving? Maybe. But it's not clear that they actually had relevant samples. So there was one guy at the Wuhan CDC who had collaborated with some people, and that's because he was mainly involved in doing field work with bats.
And this is Dr. Tian?
Yeah, this is Dr. Tian. So he, has been very involved in all this quote unquote adventurous work, going into caves, trapping bats, taking samples from bats, sometimes taking samples from other animals too. This is important work, virus discovery work. But importantly, this guy was not actually so much of a virologist. He wasn't bringing bats back to the Wuhan CDC. But in all of his papers, anytime there was any sort of virus isolation, it was clearly done somewhere else where they had an appropriate containment lab, and also probably where they had expertise in growing viruses. Because despite what you might think and how some people portray this, viral genomic sequence is not a recipe. You can't just do something like on CSI where you type in a sequence and then, your little virus printer is going to spit out a custom virus. It doesn't work like that. And it's actually technically pretty difficult. Whether you're talking about isolating a virus from a tissue sample that you've collected or a fecal sample that you've collected, that's even more difficult. To making a reverse genetic system based on a sequence. Now, it can all be done, but is it something that some guy who's mostly famous for going out and catching bats is doing in his spare time? Probably not. And it's pretty clear from looking at his work that he wasn't doing any kind of, virus isolation, much less cloning viruses and making chimeric viruses and doing all this, gain of function-y stuff that a lot of people have implicated in this. And again, we don't know what the DOE's evidence was, but it doesn't explain how you would then have two spillovers 2 weeks apart. And if Dr. Tian was the only one who was working on those bats and those things at the WCDC, then what? Did he get infected with lineage B, go have lunch at the Wuhan market, and then 2 weeks later got infected with lineage A? I mean, I suppose that it's possible, but I just don't think that that's a very likely explanation.
Given the limits of what China is willing to share, can we ever know?
There's a lot of speculation about China covering things up and not telling the whole truth and being secretive. And, that seems to be kind of across the board how the Chinese government operates about a lot of things. That doesn't mean that we cannot trust any of the evidence we have from China. That also doesn't mean that we'll never find the answer. But one thing that's very clear to me, and that I don't think people really appreciate, is that in the course of talking about these deleted databases and all these hypothetical things China has done to cover up a lab origin, people are overlooking the things that we all know that they've done that potentially would cover up a market origin. And that is going to make it more difficult for us to conclusively demonstrate that that's how it started. For example, January 1st, 2020, Wuhan market, the world found out the day before about this new viral pneumonia that was spreading. And January 1st, Wuhan market shut down, all animals removed, property disinfected, animals probably culled, animals not mentioned, and the market has not reopened. So it's not selling animals, it's not selling meat, it's not selling produce, it's not selling seafood, it's not selling shit. And on top of that, Michael Standard has reported fairly extensively as he could when he was still in China, that in the farms in Hubei province, all of those farms have been shut down and they also have not reopened. So not only can we not get samples if they weren't taken from the animals that were actually at Wuhan, we can't even go investigate the sources of, or the potential sources for some of these samples.
Angie says it would be extremely helpful to compare any animal samples, if they existed, to the environmental ones gathered in cages and processing areas at Wuhan market.
We have this sequence data. Now, I'll just explain very, very quickly that when you sequence stuff, it's agnostic about what species you're sequencing. So you get all these little fragments of sequence called reads, and there's millions of these. And so you use bioinformatics to assemble these into intact sequences. The paper that was published by the China CDC, led by George Gao, on February 25th, 2022, the day before our preprint came out, showed that there was lineage A at the market as well as lineage B, which was new for us, even though we'd predicted it, and actually compelled us to get our preprints out the next day because we thought it was important. That paper concluded that there was a stronger association between the viral sequences and these other sequencing reads in those samples from humans. But what it didn't show was what other species had sequencing reads in there. And there were a lot of unmapped reads. And basically, if we had the raw data for those sequences, we could find out what species those unmapped reads were mapping to. And
so you could see that's a raccoon dog,
Correct.
That's a whatever.
Exactly. The key is that raw data also hasn't been shared, which is why that paper probably hasn't been published, because in order to publish in a reputable journal, you are required to deposit your raw data into a public database or repository. So there is some data that might give us some more insight about this. But because there was a concerted effort, I think, to not look in the animals when it was clear that this was associated with a market where live animals were sold, there was a real effort, I think, to prevent that data from ever being collected and to prevent access to anything that would really implicate the live animal trade. Because again, that's been recognized as a risk for the last 20 years, ever since SARS emerged. And it's a little embarrassing that that this happens, despite the fact that there was a lot of effort put into trying to prevent that from happening.
How much does solving this riddle, pinpointing the origin, matter? Like, might we be better off if sort of societally people could say, like, okay, this could have come from, zoonotic transfer. It could have come from some type of lab accident. Let's focus on the future? Or is that like a false dichotomy?
I think it's really, we need to do both things, right? Like, I think it is important to find out the origin with a strong level of confidence. But we don't necessarily have to get started on trying to think about future pandemic prevention and preparedness and response efforts. But the reason why it's important to know how this pandemic started is we don't want to waste a lot of time doing even more stuff to prevent lab leaks, when the reality is the most dangerous gain-of-function lab in the world is run by Mother Nature, who is doing gain-of-function research through evolution with countless viruses, many more than we know. Definitely SARS coronavirus 3 is out there. Definitely MERS coronavirus 2 is out there. There may even be other types of coronaviruses that we've never seen emerge into the human population that could potentially be pandemic pathogens. So if we are spending all of our time worrying about the hypothetical threat of a lab-acquired infection or a lab leak, then we're not devoting the same resources and the resources that we should be devoting to these very real problems that pose tremendous threats to us, potentially existential threats. Do you know how much worse the SARS-2 pandemic would have been if it had been caused by a more transmissible SARS-1? SARS-1 is a 10% case fatality rate. If it had been caused by MERS, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that's potentially an existential threat to our civilization. MERS has a case fatality rate of about 30 to 35%. Can you imagine if 1 out of every 3 people who got COVID died from it? That's something I think that people have kind of not thought about. They're thinking about, the millions who have died from COVID, which is obviously terrible, but they're not thinking about how it could have been many millions more if it had been a different virus, which may well be out there. I don't think we should ever assume that as viruses get more transmissible or more human adapted, they become attenuated, because we have a lot of counterexamples of them not doing that. Has Ebola gotten, milder over the last 50 years since it emerged? It has not. So I think that we really do need to be thinking about origins, not just in helping us identify these threats, but also helping us focus our efforts to mitigate these threats going forward. And to me, there's a really disproportionate use of resources if you're providing this sort of false equivalence that either the lab or the market are equally possible, because then you're going to respond to them as if they're equally dangerous, and they're not.
Angie Rasmussen, I can't thank you enough for walking through all of this with me and for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on here, Lizzie.
Angie Rasmussen is a virologist at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Evan Campbell. Our show is edited by Shannon Pallas. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio for Slate. TBD is part of the larger What Next family, and we're also part of Future Tense, a partnership of Slate, Arizona State University, and New America. And if you're a fan of the show, I have a request for you. Become a Slate Plus member. Just head on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. All right, we'll be back on Sunday with another episode. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks for listening.